Esther chapter 5. You should have a sheet there in front of you. I titled it Royal Robes or Old Garments. Royal Robes or Old Garments. We got an extra sheet to give to Matt down there. Anybody got one? Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Okay, I'm going to jump right into it. You should be up to date. Guys, listen, this is a practice I do. I call it landmarking. And what I mean by landmarking is, when I'm going through the Bible, how many of you struggle to remember where things are at in the Bible? I had a friend named Greg Lovell. He'd always say, I can't ever remember the address. I don't know where nothing's at, okay? So I struggle with that too. But what I try to do, when I'm going through a book of the Bible, I try to remember one thing from every chapter. So I know in John 1, I got in the beginning was the Word. I know that in John chapter 2, I got the wedding feast at the Cana of Galilee. I know in John chapter 3 that I've got the episode of Nicodemus. I know that in John chapter 4, I got the woman at the well. I know in John 5, he talks about the resurrection. I know in John 6, he talks about the bread come down from heaven. That's that type of, you know what I mean? So I can't tell you everything in all those chapters, but I can fill in the blanks in the stories when I landmark it. So let's try to do the same thing in the book of Esther. Okay, so as you're reading, you need to be reading Esther every week. I'm reading all of Esther every week. You say, Zach, you got time. It don't take 15 minutes to read the whole book of Esther, okay? It's short, right? I know it's 10 chapters, but they're not long chapters, okay? So let's get going. Royal robes or old garment. What happened last week? Where did we end off at? Haman had the letter signed. Ahasuerus signed it. They're going to kill all the who. And the problem was they don't want all the Jews killed. If you're Jewish, you didn't. So what did Mordecai, Esther, and all their friends do? They did two things. Starts with a P, one of them, and the other one starts with an F. Prayer and fasting. Prayer and fasting. Esther decides she's going to go in before the king, and here we are in Esther chapter 5 before the king. She's got to make a petition. Now it happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace across from the king's house while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house. There's a lot of royalty going on here. Facing the entrance of the house. So it was when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand, and Esther went near, touched the top of the scepter. Now, look, I'm not going to talk about the scepter again. I just released last week's Sunday school lesson this morning, so it's on the YouTube page. You can go back and watch it. If you weren't here last week, we talked about the scepter. So I'm not skipping it, but we dealt with it last week. Verse 3. The king said to her, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What's your request? It shall be given to you up to half the kingdom." So Esther answered, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for them." Okay, look at your notes. Esther will now appear before Ahasuerus after prayer and fasting. The text goes out of its way to emphasize the fact that she put on her royal robes. Now tell me, why would we be emphasizing the fact and idea of royal robes and clothing based on everything we've talked about the last 2 or 3 weeks? Where have we been going in the last 2 or 3 weeks? Every week we've gone here for the last 2 or 3 weeks. What New Testament text to talk about clothing? I have failed you, I have failed you, I have failed you. 2 Corinthians, what chapter? 5. Good. And that's where Paul said we don't want to be unclothed, but what? We want to be further clothed. And what was Paul talking about? Were the Corinthians running around half naked? Not physically, okay? We said that they were clothed. Clothed with what? Old covenant, old garments. They didn't want to be found naked and in shame, meaning having no clothing, no covenantal relation to God, but they wanted to be what kind of clothed? Further clothed. In what kind of clothing? New covenant glory. They wanted to be clothed in new covenant glory. This is covenantal, spiritual. Here's why I'm saying this. I'm of the opinion that there are a couple things that are going on here. Esther calls them to a banquet. And it seems to me that it's like a wedding banquet. All right? She's calling them to a banquet, and the text is emphasizing clothing. And we're going to see how she shows up at this banquet. What does the text say at the very beginning right there in verse 1? It happened on the third day that Esther put on her what? Okay. And we said that last week the whole issue in chapter 4 was who could go into the king uninvited. But she's going in like she's going into the Holy of Holies to talk to the king, and she's got to have the proper attire and the proper clothing on. Just as today, if men want to come back into the presence of God, they got to have the proper clothing. Who do they have to put on today? We talked about this last week. They have to put on Christ. Okay? They have to put on. And how do you put on Christ? Through faith. That's it. Simple. How do I put on Christ? I believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm saved. Okay. All right. I put all that in the notes. Well, you know. This is pointing us to a clothing that is pleasing to and allows her to go before the king. Her physical dressing points us to a spiritual clothing of the new covenant. They were to put on Christ. 1 Peter declared that the church was a royal priesthood, a royal bride. We won't turn there again, but 2 Corinthians 5, 1-4 is the place to go to see this spiritual clothing. Without question, Matthew 14 and the death of John the Baptist plays off of this text. Let's go over there and look at Matthew chapter 14 right quick. Hold your spot. The reason that I say it plays off this text is because here in Esther, you've got a godly bride displaying her royal robes. And to be quite frank, in Matthew chapter 14, you've got a not royal bride displaying her not so royal clothing, I think. Here is what happens. So, Matthew 14:1. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus and said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He's risen from the dead. And therefore these powers are at work in him. For Herod laid hold of John and bound him, put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. Herod, bad king. Ahasuerus, good king. Herod had laid hold of John the Baptist and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John said to him, 'It's not lawful for you to have her.' Although he wanted to put him to death, he feared the multitude, just like Haman feared Mordecai, because they counted him as a prophet. But when Herod's birthday was celebrated, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Therefore he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask." Sound familiar? He's pleasing to her just like Esther, or she's pleasing to him just like Esther was to Ahasuerus. So she, having been prompted by her mother, said, "Give me John the Baptist's head on a platter." Now, if you go to other texts, if you go to Mark, what it says that he says, "I'll give it to you up to half of my kingdom." Okay? So it's the same deal. You can go read it in Mark. It's all over there. I don't want to go read it all over the place, but that story's there. It's playing on it without question. Look at your notes. Matthew 14 and the death of John the Baptist plays on this text. The pleasing of the king and the offering of the half the kingdom are parallel in Esther and Matthew. Only in Matthew do you have a wicked king and a wicked bride. And here in our text today, you've got a good king and a good bride. Okay? So, to say it another way, she's a harlot. He's a harlot king. She's a harlot bride. They're bad. All right? Look at Esther chapter 5, and let's look at verses 5-8. Actually, let's just read the rest of the chapter right quick. How much is this? Yeah, let's read the rest of the chapter right quick. Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said." So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And at the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What's your petition? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom. It shall be done." Esther answered and said, "My petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and my full request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." Okay, banquet number 1, there. What does she say here in this text? Nothing. Let me have another banquet tomorrow. Okay, stop just for a second. We'll come back to that, but remember that part, okay? Because I'm reading the commentaries and they're like, well, she was scared. Like she just got cold feet, didn't really want to ask and tell the whole deal. And okay, maybe, but there might be more. All right, let's look at verse 9. Haman went out that day. Now remember, we had the first banquet. He's leaving. Haman went out that day joyful with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation, anger, against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home and sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Now watch this. This is interesting. Haman told them of his great riches, multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above all the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, besides Queen Esther, invited no one but me to come in with the king, the banquet that she prepared, and tomorrow I am again invited by her along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made 50 cubits high, 75 feet. In the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. This is good. I want to state this right off the bat though. Some super speculation going on possibly by me in this text. And I say that sometimes, meaning, sometimes I'll say like, take this with a grain of salt, or you do with it what you want, or sometimes I'm really pretty confident when I say that. This might be like a toss it and weigh it type of deal. Okay, so let's go with it. Look at your notes. First banquet. On the outskirts, it really looks like there's not much going on in this first banquet. Some commentators, such as Charles Spurgeon, think that she might have been scared. Okay, because if Ahasuerus says, I'm not pleased with you, I don't like your royal robes, what's he going to do to her? He's going to kill her. And then it's going to be death to the people that are with her. So, Spurgeon said, it may be that Esther could not find the courage to present her request and used the successive banquets as a delaying tactic. Some of us are very unaccountable, but on that woman's unaccountable silence far more was hanging than appears at first sight. Doubtless she longed to bring out her secret, that she was a Jew and she didn't want him killed, but the words came not. God was in it. It was not the right time to speak, and therefore she was led to put off her disclosure. I dare say she regretted it and wondered when she should be able to come to the point, but the Lord knew best. I don't know where Spurgeon's getting that from, okay? But I mean, maybe she was scared and maybe whatever. But I think there's more going on to this story. Now, I always have a tendency to think that there's more going on to the story. So maybe this is literally just some narrative part of the story that doesn't have a New Testament connection and doesn't have all these other connections. But boy, if I was going to bet $552,000 on it, I'd bet the other way. I'm just telling you. Because everything else in this is showing all these overlays. So, maybe. I mean, that's part of it, for sure. I just always think there's more. Okay, you know how people read the Bible, like, you hear some people teach the Bible, and like, they give you all the factual stuff, which I'm good with, we need, and then they give you all this practical application, but then you hear somebody else teach the Bible, and you're like, all right, well, he's making these connections over here and these other connections over here. Like, I always tend to be on the backside of that, trying to make these connections, and sometimes I probably make some connections where I don't need to make connections. But like, I just see more than, I think what you just said is exactly right, okay? Like, because he obviously thinks he's cool after this first banquet. But there's a second banquet coming, and there's just a lot of things in this that make me see some other stuff, especially knowing the New Testament. Okay, let's keep going. I mean, maybe, but I have a hard time believing that is all that's going on here. So I will speculate. And I say a lot that I'm unsure, but really I'm speculating here. I could possibly be more sure of this later on. That's typically what I do. I'll look at something and see it, and then I'm like, all right, I see that, and then about 2 months down the road, I go back to it, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's 100% sure thing, or, oh, I whiffed that. But let me show you what I'm getting at. Verse 11 is the one that tips my hat to this deal. Look back at verse 11 right quick. Esther 5:11 says this. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children. Somebody read that so I can write it down. He told them of his riches. What else?
The multitude of his children and everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king.
Sound familiar, anybody? Let's go to our notes. There are two banquets. One is good for Haman and results in his bragging in verse 11. The second banquet, spoiler alert, will lead to his death. This is an old covenant picture. Everything in verse 11 is true of old covenant Israel, who was wed to God at Mount Sinai. You got to think, Old Covenant is a wedding ceremony. Sinai is a wedding ceremony. Jeremiah 3:14, return, O backsliding children, says the Lord, for I'm what? I'm married to you. I will take you, one from a city and two from a family. I'll bring you to Zion. Exodus 24:7, he reads them the law. He took the book of the covenant, read in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has said, we will what? To say it another way, they said, I do. Okay? There's all kind of Old Testament. Read Ezekiel 16. Read all of Jeremiah 1 to like 10. That God's married to Israel everywhere. Okay? It's a wedding picture and wedding idea. Let me follow my notes so I don't get off. Haman could rule alongside of Vashti, the first bride. Does that make sense? His ordinances go along with that just fine. But now Haman will not be able to coexist. I felt so progressive typing that out. I just thought I just had a tingle go through my spine. And I thought, Haman will not be able to coexist with the new bride, Esther. Anybody want to tell me where we're going here, or you want to just keep reading? I believe the New Testament, Esther will have another leader by her side, whose name is Mordecai, whom Haman cannot stand. And I believe that the New Testament gives light to the fact that the Old Covenant ordinances desired to remain around with the New Covenant. Hence, the Judaizers. The Judaizers were not 100% against Jesus. Okay? There were some of them clearly that rejected Jesus. But the Judaizers were saying this: Jesus is fine, but we keep the priesthood. That he can be king. Why do they want Jesus to be king? What do they want him to do? Get rid of the Romans. He can be king. We keep the covenant type stuff. We keep that. We keep the priesthood. What was the problem with that? They were never going to coexist. Jesus said it over and over. Look at your notes here. They weren't all teaching that Christ was bad, only that Christ and the Old Covenant priesthood and rituals would rule together. Do y'all remember, man, I don't want to get too much into this. Do y'all remember Hymenaeus and Philetus, how they were upsetting the faith of people? Hymenaeus and Philetus in the book of Timothy. Paul wrote to them and said that Hymenaeus and Philetus were upsetting the faith of some, okay? Here's why I think they were upsetting the faith of some. Because when Hymenaeus and Philetus were saying that the new order had come, they would have been saying Jesus was ruling and the old temple in Jerusalem was still standing. Hence, you would have had the new covenant order come in full, the kingdom come, and the old covenant ordinances still around. Well, what was the problem with all that? Jesus had issues with it. He clearly said everywhere, those two things aren't going to exist together. Look at our next paragraph. Jesus reminded them that you can't put cloth on a new garment, and reminiscent here of verse 6 in Esther 5, you can't put the old wine into the what? Makes sense? What does she say that first banquet is? Look at the text, Esther chapter 5, verse 6. At the banquet of what? There you go. There's a reason that the text is throwing all this stuff in there. This isn't for no reason. It's all in there for a purpose. You can't put the old wine into the new wineskins. Mordecai is in Haman's way. Well, I skipped that. New banquet, new marriage, new wine. Mordecai is in Haman's way, so he seeks Mordecai's death, not realizing that the death of Mordecai would only lead to Mordecai and Esther's exaltation. Make sense, everybody? All right, I wrote this on the board a while ago. Go read Deuteronomy. I think it's like Deuteronomy 8. And it talks about how God gave them the ability to make wealth. God told Abraham, I'll make your descendants as numerous as the sand of the sea and as numerous as the stars. There you go. God made Israel the highest of all, above all, seated them in the ruling positions. They literally called the holy place the heavens. That's the whole picture. And all this is true of Mordecai. And this is why I think in verse 11 there in Esther chapter 5, he goes out of his way and says, man, after the first banquet, after the marriage, after the institution of the old covenant per se, let me tell you about my great riches. Let me tell you about my multitude of kids. With me? Well, watch this. Go to Galatians chapter 4. Let me show you this one right quick. Multitude of kids, descendants as numerous as the stars, sand of the sea. Galatians chapter 4. This is good. Because during the time of the New Testament, there was a change that was happening. There was a plethora of Old Covenant believers and a small amount of New Covenant believers to start. And as the gospel spread, we get this. And Paul's comparing the two Jerusalems, the Old Jerusalem, Old Covenant, New Jerusalem, New Covenant. And look at what he quotes from Isaiah 54:1 in Galatians 4:27. For it's written, rejoice, O barren. Remember, that's a New Covenant theme, the children of promise. All those barren wombs point to the New Covenant child being born, the church. You who do not bear, break forth and shout, you who are not in labor, for the desolate, the New Covenant now, has many more children than she who has a what? See how he compared that, Old and New Covenant? So what you've got is, Old Covenant Israel was married and she had a lot of kids. Well, the New Covenant church was being persecuted, just like Haman is doing to Mordecai and Esther. They're going to break forth and shout, and there's going to be a new banquet with a new wedding. Y'all didn't get it? Too much? Okay. Nevertheless, I carry on. Okay, so Haman is going to kill Mordecai, i.e., hang him on the gallows at the end of Esther 5. Look at 1 Corinthians 2. We speak wisdom of God in a mystery, the hidden wisdom that God ordained before the ages for our glory, which none of the rulers of this age knew, for if they had known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. And I'm telling you, if Haman would have known that hanging Mordecai on the gallows and preparing those gallows would have led to his death and Mordecai's exaltation, he wouldn't have done that either. That's the same thing. That's a Psalm 2 picture. So, Haman plots with his wife, he plots with his friends, and no doubt if he's the highest seated in that kingdom, some of those friends were other rulers of that kingdom. That screams Psalm 2 when I read it this week. The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord, against His anointed. What does the text say in Psalm 2? God sits in the heavens and He laughs. Laughs. At this point, Mordecai is essentially dead. You say, Zach, Mordecai didn't die. He didn't kill him. You can't say Mordecai's dead. Oh, yes, I can. Go to Hebrews 11 right quick. I'll show you this. This is the same story as the Abraham story. Hebrews chapter 11. Mordecai has all power, control, and authority in that kingdom. If Haman does. If Haman has all authority, control in that kingdom, when he says prepare the gallows, they're getting prepared. This thing is as good as done. Watch this. Hebrews 11:17. By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promise offered up his only begotten son, which by the way he also had Ishmael, but this was the son of promise who would inherit the covenant, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him. How? What kind of sense? So you know what that's saying? Abraham had purposed it in his heart that he was going to kill the son. He was as good as dead. Friends, can I tell you, at this point when Haman makes him gallows, Mordecai, in a figurative sense, is as good as dead. What day did Esther go in on? In verse 1, in Esther chapter 5. What day? It's all there. I'm telling you. The whole gospel story. Friends, if you can't see the gospel in the Old Testament, we did something wrong. It's all taking you to Jesus, man. This story's so good. I love this book. Who wrote this book? Anyway, we need a T-shirt that says "Who wrote this book?" Okay, like we need to make one of them. Who wrote this book? Anyway, so let's go to any thoughts, questions so far. Let me finish right quick, and then you can ask me all the questions that you want to ask me, because this was super like symbolic. Okay, Haman's demise. I hate to spoil it again, but I must. Haman will attend the second banquet, but it will not end well. Esther 7 shows us that the king leaves for the garden palace and returns to the banquet of wine. Read Esther chapter 7, verses 7 and 8. Look at this right quick. This is great. Esther 7. We'll read verses 7. And I'm going to go through 6 and 7 and 8, but I just hate to talk about it on the front end and not go connected on the back end while we're here. All right, Esther chapter 7, verse 7. So they've come to the second one. She's already said, hey, the adversary is this wicked Haman. Look at verse 6. Esther said, the adversary, the enemy, the Satan, is the wicked Haman. Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Now watch this. The king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine, and he went where? To the garden place, like Jesus left and went to the Holy of Holies before coming back in judgment. Get that? Then the king arose in his wrath in the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life. That's funny. Now Haman's standing before the bride, pleading for his life. For he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. He knew his judgment was coming. Watch this. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had done what? Fallen where? Fallen across the couch where Esther was. Somebody say that a different way, please. Haman had been placed at her feet. What does it say in Revelation 2, 9 and 3, 9? The God of peace will crush Satan under your feet shortly. I will make them come and bow down and worship at your feet and know that I have loved you. Remember in 1 Samuel 6 maybe when they steal the Ark of the Covenant and they put it in the temple with Dagon? Every morning what happened? They go in there and Dagon's fell over at the feet of the Ark of the Covenant. Hello. That's good stuff. That's why you're paying me the big bucks right there. Okay, anyway, so leave that alone. Everybody get that? This whole thing's going to end with Haman bowing to the feet of the bride, just as in the New Covenant. The Judaizers in the Old Covenant system falls in subservience at the feet to the New Covenant bride. We just went through Hebrews. Y'all should be familiar with Psalm 110. Okay. This reminds me of the parable of the wedding banquet in Matthew chapter 22. Let's go read that. In case you forgot or haven't heard me say this, the Bible is 66 books. The Bible is one book. The Bible is 66 books. The Bible is one book. It's one story. Like, I hear a lot of people say sometimes about the way me and some of my friends, like, we read the Bible and interpret it. They're like, man, you guys are just all over the place. I'm like, it's one story. Like, it is the same story. Like, it's telling the same story. Like, you can't go all over the place here. It's the same thing. It works together. Matthew 22, the parable of the wedding banquet. Super interesting. I think this is interesting. I think this is interesting. Man, this is interesting. Jesus answered and spoke to them again by parables and said, the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who arranged a marriage for his son. He sent out his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding. Who were invited. That's the covenant people. That's Israel. Were they willing, yes or no? Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 23, 37, 38? Jerusalem, Jerusalem, I wanted to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Again, he sent out other servants, saying, tell those who are invited, see, I've prepared my dinner, my oxen, my fatted cattle are killed, all things are ready, come to the wedding. But they made light of it. went their ways, one to his own farm, another to his business, and the rest seized his servants, there's his prophets and apostles, treated them spitefully, killed them. But when the king heard about it, he was furious. He sent out his armies. There's the Roman armies coming to destroy him. Like Paul said in Romans 12 and 13 would happen, that they would take vengeance on him. He sent out his armies, destroyed those murderers, and burned up their city. He said to his servants, the wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not what? Remember the name of the servant who gave instructions to get rid of Vashti at the very beginning in chapter 1? Remember his name? Anybody know it? Memucan. What does his name mean? Worthy. And they're going to send out letters, and those who believe and follow Mordecai and Esther are worthy. Those who follow the bride and Christ are worthy. He said to his servants, the wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Therefore go into the highways, and as many as you find, invite to the wedding. Remember how Haman emphasized that he was the only one invited to that first wedding? Notice how the New Covenant gospel reaches the nations and accomplishes it, unlike the first Old Covenant kingdom did? Yeah, same story. Therefore, go into the highways, and as many as you find, invite to the wedding. So those servants went out into the highways and gathered together all whom they found, both good and bad. And the wedding hall was filled with guests. Now watch this, it's interesting. When the king came in to see the guest, he saw a man there who did not have on a what? Doesn't say he was naked. He had on a garment, but it was what kind of garment? Not a wedding garment. He had on old, dusty, nasty garment, moth-eaten garment that was going to rust and perish and fade away like James 5 and Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. So he said to him, friend, how did you come in here without a what? Wedding garment. He was speechless. Then the king sent servants, bind him hand and foot, take him away, cast him into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called and few are chosen. See how that connects to Paul's doctrine of being clothed in 2 Corinthians chapter 5? They had to be clothed in new covenant glory. If this guy had a garment on, then this meant that he had what kind of glory? Old covenant glory. And he didn't have the proper glory. That's why Paul said in 2 Corinthians 5, we don't desire to be unclothed, but further clothed. They needed new covenant garments. So to say it another way, what's the garment? If Paul's doctrine continually in the New Testament was to put on who? Put on Christ. And to put on Christ was to believe in Christ. If this person who's at this wedding, he attended the wedding and had a garment on, but not a wedding garment, then he hadn't put on or he hadn't believed in. Make sense? So just like Haman, who wouldn't accept Mordecai, Haman comes to the second banquet, but he's got the wrong clothing on because he can't accept Mordecai and Esther. He won't submit or be subservient to Mordecai and Esther. Therefore, Haman is judged and hanged on the gallows, which is the exact picture of the Matthew 22 people who have the wrong clothing, but they show up to the wedding. Last paragraph. Both Haman and Israel, the son, attend the wedding, but they don't partake. Haman rejects Mordecai. Israel rejects Jesus. They had on the wrong garment. Garments of the old regime. You can't put the old cloth into the new garment. Clinging to the letters of death that could never inherit the promises. Upon the king's return, Haman and the Judaizing Christ rejectors would be found unworthy. Too much? No? You didn't? Okay, sorry, that was too much. Anybody follow any of that, or was that a complete waste of 30 minutes?
I was looking up Mimi King because I didn't hear what it said about it, and it said Haman was also called Mimi King.
Haman was also called worthy. At the beginning he was, but when he rejects Mordecai's ascension, then he's unworthy. Just like the Old Covenant. They were accepted. The old 2 Corinthians 3, the Old Covenant had glory. It was not bad, but when the new regime came, they should have realized it and subjected it. That's why Hebrews chapter 2 says that he has not put, or Hebrews 1 and 2 says, to which of the angelos did he ever say, sit at my right hand? And he says, you're my beloved son, I've begotten you, and raised him up and seated him over it. So, any other questions? Nothing, huh? Now, y'all not going to give me any comments or feedback on that? Is that too much? I must be the greatest teacher in the world. There's no questions after that one. I mean, holy smokes, people. Do you think that's a stretch? Daniel thinks it's a stretch.
You think there's got anything to do with Genesis in this story?
What? Which part?
The garments?
Oh, yeah, that's where I went last week.
Yeah.
No, I just posted it. Yeah, we went there. So, just by way of review, does that bell ring yet?
Yeah.
I'll hurry. Yeah, Diana was so locked in, she didn't even notice that bell. Those Genesis garments, one way or another. Okay, just review the Genesis garments right quick. What happens in the Genesis garments? How do they start out in the garden? Was there an issue? Not at that point. When did the issue come? When they ate of the tree. And specifically, it was the tree of knowledge So when they eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what do they realize? Adam says this word. He's in what? He said, the woman deceived me, I ate of the tree, and I was what? Because she was deceived, I ate of the tree, and we were... Yeah, they were afraid because the judgment was coming. Why? Because they didn't have a clothing. They were naked and not afraid. They were naked and ashamed. Okay, they were naked and afraid, but they were naked and ashamed. So what'd they do? They made their own clothing. They made a house with hands. Made it with their own hands. But how does it end? How does Genesis chapter 3 end? What does God do? Notice, this clothing helped them to avoid the judgment, but this clothing would be even better. This clothing was without hands. This clothing had the shedding of blood. Make sense, everybody? All right, now go to 2 Corinthians 5 again, and I won't go here for another 4 months if y'all quit asking me questions about Genesis. He clothes them, then you get the shedding of blood. I don't know if it's prophetic or not, Genesis 3, pointing you to this, but Paul is definitely playing off of it. The only way I know for you to get this is for me to keep repeating it. 2 Corinthians, go back and just read 2 Corinthians 3-7 sometime. Look at 2 Corinthians 5:1. We know that if our earthly house, this tent, that is not talking about the physical body, that's talking about the old covenant system, the house that they were in. Jesus said, Matthew 23:38, see now your house is left to you desolate. It's going to be destroyed. If this tent is destroyed, where did Paul get it? He got it from Jesus. We have a building from God, a house. How is it made? Not made with physical human hands, made without hands, Daniel 2, the stone cut without hands, the kingdom of God, eternal in the heavens. That's going to come down, Revelation 21. That kingdom's going to come. That's what that is. For in this, not the physical body, but under the old covenant, under Adam, we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed how? With new covenant glory. When will they put this on? At the wedding that takes place at that time. The new covenant wedding. I think one of the craziest things we ever thought about was that the wedding, the marriage supper of the Lamb, is still 2,000 years in the time of Jesus' future. That's the craziest. We got the longest engagement I've ever seen. I mean, me and Andrew were together like 9 years before we got married, and that was forever. I mean, you think he went without a bride for that long? That's crazy. He's going to clothe her at the wedding. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed with our habitation, which is from heaven. That's covenantal, friends, not physical. If indeed, having been clothed, we shall not be found what? He was naked. He had the law revealed to him. He ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, just like Israel was given the law. She's revealed her sin, so she's in shame, just like you and I are. See, when we were born, we didn't have the law. But some preacher told us the gospel, and we realized, oh, snap. I'm in trouble. I'm a sinner. I need Christ. So we're ashamed. So you and I now don't go under the old covenant and put on old covenant garments and old covenant glory. You and I come straight to Christ and we believe in Him and we put on the clothing that God provided for us through His Son. But here's the difference. When 2 Corinthians 5 was wrote, the fullness of this clothing hadn't yet come. It came at the marriage. It came at the kingdom when the old one was destroyed and taken away. That's why they're worried in 2 Corinthians 5. They're saying, look, we relate to God through the old covenant. If we don't have that, what are we going to get? You're going to relate fully to God through Jesus Christ. He'll clothe you in a better glory. That's why 2 Corinthians 3:7 says, it's not that the old covenant didn't have glory. It had glory. But boy, it paled in comparison. Just like Moses, when his face came off, it stopped shining. But what they were doing in the New Testament, the Judaizers were, that glory and that place, the old covenant, stopped shining, and they still had that veil on. And that's why in 2 Corinthians 3 and 4 he says, their eyes are still veiled who haven't believed in the Lord Jesus Christ. Powerful. So watch what Paul says. Verse 4. We who are in this tent groan being burdened. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 11? Come to me, all you who are weak or heavy laden. My yoke is easy and my is light. They were in affliction and bondage as slaves. They're groaning, Paul said, going back to, why have you entangled yourself again to a yoke of bondage? 2nd Exodus imagery, Galatians 5. We who are in this tent groan being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed. We don't want to be naked in shame with no clothing, but we want to be clothed in the new covenant. Why? So that mortality, the spiritual death, may be swallowed up by what? Life. Spiritually, you are immortal. You have put on immortality. I told a preacher that about 3 weeks ago. He thought it was the craziest thing. He said, you think that I've put on immortality right now? I said, yep, because you don't understand the terms, buddy. The terms are covenantal. The terms are not physical. Now, He who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who's given us the Spirit as a guarantee. Friends, I don't know if you can see it or not. And everything I might have just said for the last 40 minutes might have been 20 miles over your head, or mine might have been completely wrong. But boy, that wedding theme and feast and garment theme in Esther chapter 5 to 7 points you straight to Paul's new covenant glory, which connects you back to Genesis, some way or another.
It's also interesting with the whole Esther stuff and the Corinthians 5 and all that, because Paul says, 1 Corinthians 13, 15, that he quotes Isaiah 25, and death is swallowed up at the wedding supper, at the marriage supper of the Lamb. So that happens in tandem.
It's good. What death? That's why Paul says in that very same passage that mortality will be swallowed up by immortality, because the death they're trying to defeat are what Haman's letters of death, which is the old covenant. 2 Corinthians 3 is the covenant of death. It's keeping them in bondage in death. It can't ever set them fully free, but Jesus Christ can when He clothes them fully. That's why the dead come out of Hades at that time, and that's why the living from that time on die and go to be with the Lord and not go to Hades. Because you got it. You got it. The whole thing's telling the gospel, man. You got it. We're just viewing the gospel from 40,000 foot every week. I love it. Narrow it in, believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. Zoom it out, you got a whole story that's awesome. No? Okay. You can shoot me an email. Come visit me in my office if you didn't like it. Anyway, that's all I got. That's the best the old boys got. I don't think it's too much of a stretch on some of those connections. So, all right, let's pray.